Let's make my modern sun rays quilt pattern using 12 fat quarters and 2.5 yards of background fabric, creating a 62-inch by 81-inch twin size quilt. I am using a collection called Frisky by Zen Chic for Moda Fabrics. The background is also a print from within the collection. This fat quarter bundle is massive. However, I am only selecting 12 fat quarters that are the orange and yellow prints from within this collection. I will use the rest for a different project later on. Now let's get started. With your background yardage, cut 12 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch rectangles and 36 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles. The remaining yardage will be used for your sashing and border. Then with each of your fat quarters, you will cut one 8.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle, one 2.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle, one 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle, two 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangles, and lastly, two 2.5-inch squares. The 18-inch side of my fat quarter is horizontal, and here is what it will look like when you cut from your fat quarters. There will be fabric left over. I'll cut the remaining into 2.5-inch strips, and there will be enough for a scrappy binding if you'd like. All of these measurements will be listed down below in the video's description. You'll repeat this step to all of your print fat quarters. Now let's start building our quilt block. To create one quilt block in your print fabrics, select one 8.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle, one 2.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle, one 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle, two 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangles, and lastly, two 2.5-inch squares. Then with your background fabric, you will need three 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles and one 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch rectangles. You'll place your blocks out like so. Then we will be sewing the strip part from the center and working our way out. First, take your background 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle and sew the print 2.5-inch squares to the top and bottom. Then with that unit, you will sew your print 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle to the right side, following by the background 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles to the top and bottom. Then a background 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch rectangle to the right side, followed by a print 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle to the top and bottom, and lastly the print 2.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle to the right side, leaving you with a 8.5-inch by 16.5-inch pieced rectangle. You will then take that piece and sew it to the print 8.5-inch by 16.5-inch rectangle, leaving you with a 16.5-inch quilt block. This pattern looks like a lot of pieces, but it does come together pretty quickly, and all you have to do is repeat this step until you have made a total of 12 quilt blocks. Once all of your blocks are made, you will lay them out in a 3x4 block layout. For my odd rows, the strip side will be on the right side, and for my even rows, the strip side will be on the left side. You'll then add 2.5-inch strips between your blocks and rows for your sashing. Sew your blocks and sashing into rows, and lastly, your rows and sashing to create a quilt top. Lastly, we will be cutting a 5.5" by Moda Fabric strips to add a border around the entire quilt. I like to do the sides first, then the top and bottom. Here is what my quilt top looks like all completed. For the backing, I am using a coordinating print from within the collection, and for my thread choice, I selected glide threads in the color Military Gold. Here is a close-up of my quilt all completed. I chose a very simple squiggly wave line, keeping it modern and simple. And here is a larger photo of the quilt to give you a better look as we created jumbo quilt blocks. Once again, 12 fat quarters and 2.5" yards of background fabric will create a 62" by 81" twin size quilt. And if you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you could be notified for your next amazing quilt project.